Donald Trump may have just saved the Liberal Party's sinking ship. The polls that we're seeing come out, especially over the last week, are not great. So in January, Trudeau's Liberals were at an all-time low. In fact, the Liberal Party's popularity was at a staggering 16%. Justin Trudeau's personal popularity was at 24%. But now the polls are climbing pretty steeply in their favor, and it's all because of a combination of both Trump's tariff attacks and, of course, Trudeau's resignation at the end of January. So I'm going to cite some polls here just to give you an idea of what the political landscape looks like at the moment. I want to give a cautionary note here, of course, because polls, as Peter Hitchens famously said, are taken as much to shape public opinion as to reflect it. That said, the Conservative Party is definitely in a panic over these polls. And so the reality is we have to react to these numbers as if they are real. So let me just give you the analysis that came out from the latest CBC aggregation of the polls. Now, here's what they said. Recent federal polls have shown a dramatic shift in Canadians' voting preferences, but analysts say there is no guarantee it's a lasting trend. So it could be just a sort of snapshot in time right after a lot of the Trump tariff bluster. And there's so many different things that could take place in the next days and weeks that might totally change that. But that said, this is what we're looking at. CBC's poll tracker has clocked a massive Conservative lead for the better part of 2 years, but survey results from the past few weeks show that lead is quickly evaporating. An Ipsos poll conducted between February 21 and 24, so about a month after Trudeau's resignation, has the Liberals ahead of Conservatives among decided voters. I think that part of that could be the fact that if any of you have been on X or social media recently, the people that were bought in for Trudeau were so bought into him that he could have murdered somebody, buried their body, dug it up, showed it to everybody, and they still would have voted for him. It did not matter how many scandals he had. It didn't matter how many times he was hypocritical. They were willing to stick with him either way. So there is just a segment of the population that is going to vote Liberal until they die, full stop. The 2-point spread falls well within the 3.8% margin of error, but it's the first time Ipsos has shown the Liberals in the lead in years, erasing a 26-point Conservative lead that the firm tracked only 6 weeks ago. Right now, we have a steep curve in favor of the Liberals, the steepest we have seen in years covering the polls in Canada, says Philippe Fournier, an analyst with 338canada.com. This is not one of those crazy pollsters like Frank Graves of Ecos. This is a more reliable pollster, so we do have to take it seriously. An Abacus data poll conducted between February 20 and 25 still has the Conservatives up by 12 points, but also shows a quick upswing for the Liberals, a 9-point jump from where the party was a month ago, which again is roughly when Trudeau resigned. Fournier says the rapid gains the Liberals have made can be attributed to 3 factors: Trudeau announcing he would be stepping down, interest in the party's leadership race, and the return of U.S. President Donald Trump. I do find interest in the party's leadership race to probably be the most dubious of those 3 reasons. The other 2, I think, are manifestly true. And it's interesting to see that Conservatives, again, they had a wild lead, like 26 points. It was looking like a blowout majority no matter which poll you looked at. And that's because after nearly 10 years of Trudeau devastation, Canadians were just ready to turn the page on the Liberal Party. As I summarized in my briefing episode on Trudeau's resignation, Trudeau had gone from sort of the sunny ways savior of the Liberal Party in 2015 to an albatross around their neck. And as I noted in last week's episode, during the ongoing Liberal leadership race, the candidates are basically avoiding any use of Justin Trudeau's name. And again, it's not just Justin Trudeau that has been the entire identity of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party over the past 10 years has gone from a center-left party that did still care about fiscal prudence into essentially an extension of Justin Trudeau's character. He changed every aspect of the Liberal Party. He leaned hard into his own socially progressive agenda. He pretty much started off as leader by announcing that people with pro-life convictions could not run as Liberal MPs. And in fact, he was so rigid on that even his father, Pierre Trudeau's views would not have been acceptable in his own party. And so the Liberal Party now is an animal created by the marriage of the rump party left behind by 3 unsuccessful leaders and Justin Trudeau himself. And it's going to be really difficult to come back from that. But the 2 frontrunners for the Liberal leadership, Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney, are definitely going to try. And the way they're doing this is by basically lying about their own record as much as possible in order to convince Canadians that to vote Liberal, again, is actually about, well, sunnier ways or something. And it's been really interesting watching them trying to thread this needle between defending the last 10 years without mentioning the name of the guy in charge by trying to take credit for the good things in their view that took place over the last 10 years while still distancing themselves from Trudeau. And it's a really difficult tightrope they're trying to walk. And I do have to admit that it makes me smile to consider what it must be like for somebody like Justin Trudeau with the kind of hubris that he has, watching them run away from him like he has malaria or smallpox or COVID for that matter. That must be really, really painful for him to watch. Now, I think that Chrystia Freeland is really distinguishing herself as a remarkably dishonest person in the Liberal leadership race here, because she's basically responsible for much of what's happened over the past 10 years. Her responsibility is second only to Trudeau's himself. But now she's trying to recast herself as, wait for it, an old school Liberal. That's what she called herself over the weekend on Bill Maher's show, HBO's Real Time. Now, Chrystia Freeland's gone on Bill Maher's show a bunch of times over the previous years, and Bill Maher is obviously kind of a fan of her, which gives you an indication of how much Maher actually knows about Canadian politics, which is basically next to nothing, even though he has covered it a few times in the last couple of years. And Maher has always covered Canada as an example of sort of a woke dystopia that the Democrats should desperately avoid trying to be. But despite that, he bragged about My Girl Chrystia on one of his Club Random podcast recently with a guest whose name I forget. But he clearly thinks Chrystia Freeland is different, that she is kind of an old school Liberal like he is. And Chrystia Freeland arrived on his show wanting to play into this, wanting to emphasize that she was a Liberal like Bill Maher is. Now, Bill Maher, again, he is a hardcore old school Liberal. That is, he was in favor of redefining marriage. He's incredibly pro-abortion. He says abortion's killing, but he doesn't mind. But he thinks the gender madness thing has gone too far. There's been there's been clips that have gone viral on X just over the last week and a half of him arguing with the Pod Save America people on the transgender issue. He said that the transgender issue cost the Democrats the last election, and that if they want to keep on losing elections, they should keep on using that kind of rhetoric. But he obviously thinks Chrystia Freeland is on his side on all of those issues. And I have to point out that so all politicians engage in a bit of narrative crafting when they're trying to reset their image. So we all knew that when the Liberal leadership race began, if any of the diehard Trudeau loyalists were going to run, and obviously some of them were. Many of them stayed on the Trudeau Titanic for as long as they did because they wanted a crack at 24 Sussex eventually. We all knew that they were going to try to reset, but Freeland's lying really is in a different class. The video of her interview with Maher isn't available yet, but let me quote from the transcript because this is really exceptional stuff. So here's what Chrystia Freeland had to say. With the Prime Minister, I think every politician has their sell-by date, and that's part of what happened. But I think the other thing that happened is my party, we're actually called the Liberal Party, and I am an old-school Liberal. And Liberals in Canada win when we are focused on people and what they need in their lives, and we lose when people think that we're focused on virtue signaling and identity politics. Now, this is coming from someone, again, who has been a key figure of the Trudeau government for the duration of the Trudeau mandate. She was the Deputy Prime Minister for more than 5 years. For more than 4 years, she has been the Finance Minister. So her signature is on the fiscal mess that Canada faces. And as for all that performative stuff Trudeau did, Freeland did it all too. Well, she didn't do the India thing. She didn't dress up in costumes and go sort of gallivanting across the globe. But we don't know if she wouldn't if she didn't have the chance because she did all the other stuff. She attended Pride events and she did so with Justin Trudeau. She has very vocally supported the transgender agenda that Bill Maher just 2 weeks ago blamed for losing the Democrats' election in the United States. She was personally responsible, as I noted last week, for freezing the bank accounts of Freedom Convoy supporters. And this is particularly interesting and is evidence that Bill Maher didn't know who he was dealing with on his show because Bill Maher was so upset by the Trudeau government's crackdown on anti-vaccine protesters and people who just didn't want to take the vaccine that he actually said Trudeau, quote, sounded like Hitler when Trudeau questioned whether or not society should tolerate unvaccinated Canadians. But obviously, Maher is unaware of Freeland's key role in that crackdown. Again, she was personally responsible for freezing the bank accounts of convoy supporters, and she publicly talked about that to the media. In fact, the whole woke policies thing that's as much Freeland's modus operandi as Trudeau's. Let me give you just a couple of examples. In the 2021 budget speech, which was delivered on April 19, Chrystia Freeland emphasized the government's commitment to a feminist recovery and described it as a feminist budget that meets this moment. And she framed it as a pragmatic response to the pandemic's disproportionate impact on women. Comes as a surprise to all the men who also lost their jobs and couldn't leave their homes, rather than as kind of a brag. And in a 2022 interview with the Globe and Mail, Canada's newspaper of record, she called gender-based analysis a core part of how we govern. Now, this is not an old school liberal of the Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin type. This is very much a Trudeau woke liberal. That's how she got the job to begin with, right? Trudeau, again, remade the Liberal Party in his own image, and he handpicked her to be a member of the cabinet from the beginning, to be his deputy prime minister for more than 5 years, and to be his finance minister for more than 4 years. But despite all of that, Freeland nodded along like a puppet while Maher said this. It's the same thing that sunk the Democratic Party here in America when they went too far left. And that's the impression I got from Justin Trudeau. Why did he go and become one of those elitist type of scolds who looked like he was overbearing? That sort of left-wing overbearingness. I'm not sure that's a word, but I track with what he's saying and agree with him. Freeland also agreed with him. She said, I have received the memo, and politicians win when they listen to people sincerely and hear what people have to say about their lives. And politicians lose when we think we are smarter than the people we work for, and when we think our job is to lecture people. Well, it's a bit late for that, isn't it? This again is the finance minister who addressed the economic pain Canadians were feeling by referring to the so-called vibe session, which is to say things in Canada are pretty great, but people don't feel that they're great. And as such, she needs to respond to people's feelings, even though material reality, as shown by her gender analysis budget, said something very, very differently. This isn't listening to people. This is patronizing people. This is rooting the economy and then telling people, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. She should really do a campaign hit at the lineup outside a food bank. Millions of Canadians have been using food banks, and just asking them how they feel about the vibe session and how the lineup is treating them and whether or not they can afford a coat they need because they're standing in line. But of course, they ended the interview by talking about Pierre Poilievre. And Freeland took a shot at Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. She called him Mini Trump and then Maple Syrup MAGA, which sounds like it's something from the Beaverton. I suppose that's Chrystia Freeland's idea of a really witty thing to say. And then she added, I think he built a campaign on trying to imitate Trump, but now that Canadians see President Trump wanting to turn us into the 51st state, it's not going so well. Now, I want to pause here because my contempt for Chrystia Freeland as a politician, as a social progressive revolutionary, and as a currently lying leadership candidate is extremely large. But she's kind of partially right about this. As we indicated in the beginning, Trump's tariffs really did reset the race. And it's anybody's guess as to what reset this race more. Was it Trudeau's resignation or was it the Trump tariffs? But there's no doubt that that potent combination has totally changed the calculus for both parties. To start off, though, Poilievre is obviously not Trump by any stretch of the imagination. Canadian conservatives are just fundamentally different. Canadian conservatism, when it finally raises its weary head, is fundamentally different than American conservatism. American conservatism is rooted in life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Canadian conservatism has always been rooted in peace, order, good government. They're just different conservative traditions entirely. And Trump himself recently stated as much in a sit-down interview with The Spectator. So again, there's not video of this, but Ben Dominic of The Spectator magazine sat down with Trump in the Oval Office. And to his credit, because most American interviewers don't know much about Canada, Ben actually asked Trump directly about the effect that his statements were having on the Canadian polls. He kind of pointed out that a lot of Trump's tariff statements seemed to be boosting the Liberal political fortunes. And Trump responded, and of course, everything happening in the world, when Trump talks about it, relates directly to him somehow. So he said that conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's, quote, biggest problem is that he's not a MAGA guy, and complained that Pierre was, quote, not positive about me, as if Pierre Poilievre is supposed to thank Trump for joking about Canada being a 51st state or using economic power to bully Canada into submission. I'm really not sure what Trump expects Pierre to do under those circumstances, but there you go. Trump said, I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you, Pierre. I just don't know. I don't like what he's saying about me. It's just not positive about me. And we've done a great job, like for Canadians or... and Pierre Poilievre, who was probably extremely relieved that Trump did this. Trump did him a great favor by highlighting the distance between MAGA Trump movement and Pierre Poilievre's populist conservative movement by saying, Mr. President, it is true. I am not MAGA. I am for Canada first always. Canada has always been America's best friend and ally, but we will never be the 51st state. But it is indisputably true that Poilievre and the Conservatives are taking a major hit from Trump, because it's really given the Liberals a chance to recast themselves as defenders of Canada. And as I've mentioned before, it's a real shame that the Liberals have gotten this opportunity, because after years of trashing Canada's heritage, after years of smearing the Canadian military, I've written articles about the woke policies imposed on the military and how Canadian military magazines kind of bemoaned the problem the Canadian military was having with white guys. All of this kind of stuff has deeply undermined the morale of Canadians who want to be proud of Canada as a country and who want to be proud of Canada's heritage. But now, because the entire debate about patriotism is who is standing against Trump and all of his bluster about the 51st state stuff, and because Trudeau managed to hang on to power with the help of his buddy and less politically adept clone Jagmeet Singh, he has now gotten an opportunity that probably makes him wish he'd hung on to power a little bit longer and not resigned when he did. Canadians, meanwhile, are almost entirely fixated on the tariff threat. And understandably, because the tariffs could have a massive impact on the Canadian economy. And so Canadians are basically no longer asking the one sole question that Pierre was winning on, which is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Are you better off than you were 8 or 9 years ago? And that question really worked, because Canadians aren't better off than they were. We have a housing crisis. We have an immigration crisis. We have an inflation crisis. We have a crisis of confidence and identity crisis. And all of these things, Pierre Poilievre was really well positioned to tack on. And that's basically, his whole campaign was based on two questions. Focusing on Trump's performative wokeness and personal insufferability, which conservatives felt from the very beginning. Canadians did not, but Canadians came around to that view. And second of all, just the fact that Canadians couldn't afford things. And so Pierre Poilievre had kind of built his campaign around this idea that the Canadian dream, which is if you work hard, you can afford a house, you should be able to survive on one income, and you should be able to raise a family, had become unaffordable under Trudeau, and that he should be kicked out of office. And where the populist element of Pierre Poilievre's campaign really came in was not any social conservatism, which I would have obviously really liked to see, and I think it's a big aspect missing from Pierre Poilievre's campaign, but instead it was just sort of highlighting the fact that Trudeau's performative wokeness was a replacement for policies that actually made the lives of Canadians better. And another really key thing here is that Pierre Poilievre's candidacy kind of rose in opposition to Trudeau. And a lot of the power of Poilievre's campaign came from Pierre Poilievre being the perfect foil for Trudeau, because Trudeau is a very specific kind of politician. He's incredibly performative, and he almost always takes the bait, not the debate. And in fact, I think Trudeau is quite a bit like Trump in that way, that if you bait him properly on the right issues, he's very likely to respond. And that's where you got all those fiery clips of debates in the House of Commons between Pierre Poilievre and Justin Trudeau, when Trudeau bothered to show up in the House of Commons at all, which is it didn't take much to goad Trudeau into responding really passionately and vehemently. And if you did that enough, he was likely to let his hubris and his arrogance come out. And boom, you had a clip that would work well for an ad. You would have Trudeau doubling down on something that Canadians currently aren't a fan of. And so the whole campaign was based on the idea that Pierre Poilievre could outdo Justin Trudeau, that he could expose him in a debate, that he could trigger Trudeau's sensibilities, that he could go after his performative wokeness. And now when you subtract Justin Trudeau from that equation, suddenly you have a Conservative Party campaign that was built in response to a wildly unpopular leader whose personal popularity was at 24% in mid-January, who no longer exists. And so you have a Conservative Party campaign that's spinning its wheels for two reasons. One is that they just don't know who the leader is going to be next, so they can't recalibrate quickly enough because they don't know if they're going to be facing Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland. It's going to be one of those two. And second of all, they don't know what the main issue is going to be because their campaign was created to respond to a specific leader and the record of a specific leader. So I don't think the Liberals are going to choose Chrystia Freeland as their next leader. It may not be the coronation that a lot of, one Liberal campaign leaders and journalists are saying. I think a lot of people expect it to be a total Mark Carney coronation. That's certainly what both the Liberal Party wants, and it's certainly what the journalist class wants. For Pierre's sake, I do hope they will pick Chrystia Freeland, although I think that's unlikely, because I think she'd be a terrible but very short-lived prime minister. And she would then take her place in history alongside Kim Campbell, which, as you remember, she was prime minister for just over 4 months in 1993 when progressive conservative prime minister Brian Mulroney resigned and then had his party promptly devastated by Jean Chrétien's Liberals, who then ran the show for a decade. Freeland would allow the Conservatives to basically stick more or less to their previous campaign strategy by hammering her as Trudeau in address, which, again, as I've just highlighted, has the benefit of being true. And Freeland is kind of easy to make fun of because, again, she has this ridiculous story about one of the key reasons for joining this campaign was a 4-year-old girl in Saskatoon who asked her if she would be able to prevent Trump from invading Canada. And she repeated this story again on Bill Maher's show last weekend. And Jonathan Kay on X made a funny comment. He said, I just ran into the same girl and she was going off about the capital gains tax, because obviously this is just not the case. Obviously there wasn't a 4-year-old little girl, at least not an uncoached 4-year-old little girl, who went to Chrystia Freeland and asked her, if she was going to prevent Trump from invading Canada. And it's certainly not true that this had any reason for Freeland joining the race. Freeland has been gunning for this position for at least 10 years and probably longer. It's why she stuck it out with Justin Trudeau for so long. But Mark Carney poses a bit more of a challenge. And the reason he poses more of a challenge is one, he has a little bit more distance from the Trudeau government. Again, not much, because obviously he was very much one of Trudeau's closest advisors. He's currently trying to take credit for Canada's adept fiscal handling of the 2008 crisis, and former Prime Minister Stephen Harper has been responding to that, very upset, and saying that Mark Carney is basically taking a lot of credit for what the late Finance Minister Jim Flaherty did, which is a pretty gross thing to do. Mark Carney is also making a lot of really stupid mistakes, or maybe deliberate deceits, but for sure stupid mistakes, by saying things like, the U.S. gets the vast majority of their semiconductors from us, and if we cut that off, let's see what happens, when the reality is we're not even in like the top 6 countries for supplying them semiconductors. So it's not like Carney isn't deeply connected to the Trudeau government. Trudeau actually offered him the job, Chrystia Freeland's job, which was one of the reasons Chrystia Freeland resigned. And side note, interesting tidbit, in his interview with The Spectator, Trump actually said that the reason Justin Trudeau fired Chrystia Freeland is because he pushed Trudeau to. It'd be interesting to know if that's true. But Mark Carney still has enough distance that I think a lot of Canadians don't automatically associate him with Justin Trudeau the way they will automatically associate Chrystia Freeland with Justin Trudeau. And so Pierre Poilievre is a very skilled parliamentary debater. But again, he needs a foil, and Trudeau was the perfect counterpart, scrappy, passionate, and insufferable. And Pierre Poilievre can be the same way. He's scrappy, he's passionate, and to a certain kind of Canadian, he can come off as unsufferable. There's a lot of people who didn't like him for many, many years. But when the question was, do you want Pierre Poilievre or Justin Trudeau? Canadians by a massive majority were willing to pick Pierre Poilievre. But someone like Carney, who kind of resembles Stephen Harper in a lot of ways, he's calm, he's businesslike, he's very unlikely to take the bait the way that Trudeau would, is a lot more difficult. And so now the CPC strategy, if Mark Carney is to become the next prime minister, that had been working brilliantly, is essentially totally in the trash can. And Canadians right now are just very scared. And you can overestimate the extent to which the current collapse, I think is a fair way to put it, in Canada-U.S. relations is affecting everyday Canadians at the moment. We are seeing Canadians and Americans boo each other's national anthems at sports games. We are seeing a lot of hostility in the polls, which makes complete sense. We're seeing a lot of Canadian patriotism that essentially takes the form it usually does, which is like a kind of latent anti-Americanism that bubbles under the surface of Canadian patriotism anyways. And the fact that Trump is treating not just Trudeau, but the country with a lot of contempt really bothers a lot of Canadians deeply. And that places Pierre Poilievre in a bit of a pickle, because one of the things I notice is he hasn't been doing his big rallies recently. One of the things that really highlighted the upsurge in conservative popularity is that he was packing rallies like we hadn't seen in a very long time for a conservative leader. I've been to lots of Harper rallies. I've been to Scheer rallies, things like that. I never went to an Aaron O'Toole rally, but neither did anybody else. And they were really, really packed, and they're not doing rallies right now. And I think they're probably somewhat afraid that the real hardcore base that shows up for Pierre also is kind of sympathetic towards Trump MAGA style populism, and he doesn't really know what to do with that. And so right now, the Conservative Party is in this really difficult position of total uncertainty. They know that their previous campaign strategy isn't going to work. It can't be seamlessly moved on to a different leader, right? Carbon tax Carney is going to work, but only to a limited degree, especially if Mark Carney doesn't have any of the insufferable trigger points that Trudeau had. And that just basically means that they're stuck in a holding pattern until they know who the next leader is going to be. If it's Chrystia Freeland, they can kind of rejigger the Trudeau strategy and go after her hard. If it's Mark Carney, they're going to have to come up with something entirely different. And the likelihood at this point is that Mark Carney is going to call a snap election before Canadians have any sort of real cemented impression of him, and see if he can kind of salvage a minority government or hold the Conservatives to a minority, which will prevent them from delivering on pretty much all the things Pierre Poilievre has promised, and then come back in, overturn that minority government in pretty short order, and come back into power. There's Canadian precedent in the 40s, for example, where Liberals swapped out a leader and hung on to power for another 10 years. And so we'll see what happens. We just don't know. It's a frustrating time to be a conservative. It's a very frustrating time to try and figure out what's going on, because Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives are going to run against somebody, Chrystia Freeland or Mark Carney. And we just don't know which one is which. And we also know that boost in polls, it's probably not as exaggerated as the polls say, but it's definitely pulling them far closer than we thought possible 8 weeks ago, and certainly too close for comfort. So we'll keep on following this story, and we'll report the details as they materialize. Thanks so much for joining this week's episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. We hope you found it helpful. Please drop your comments, especially those of you who are interested in Canadian politics and the stuff we've been discussing. We'd love to hear your feedback, respond to it. If you found it helpful, please share it around, subscribe to the podcast. You can also find the audio version of this podcast wherever you download your content.